Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The pressure in the Newman estate was palpable, thicker than the plush hairpieces that lined the hallways, heavier than the demitasse chandeliers that hung from the ceilings, their light reflecting in sharp, nearly criminating angles on the polished shells. Kane and Phyllis had set up themselves trapped in a situation that felt both surreal and intimidating. A trap laid out not with brute force but with the scrupulous, calculating perfection that only Victor Newman could orchestrate. Phyllis's heart pounded in her casket, each beat echoing in her cognizance like a barrel warning of impending disaster, while Kane's jaw was tight, knuckles white as he gripped his fists, every muscle in his body tense with the fight or flight instinct screaming at him that there was no escape. Not tonight, not from Victor. The majesty of the room did nothing to soothe the fear rising in them. The walls sounded to close in, the radiance of the precious wood cabinetwork now mocking in its perfection, reminding them that Victor's wealth, power, and influence weren't just tools but munitions, and tonight they were the targets. Phyllis's mind contended, recalling every choice that had led them then, every secret, every treason, every rumored taradiddle that had compounded into this singular moment of necessary peril. Kane tried to undergird his breathing, reminding himself that he'd survived numerous of Victor's manipulations before, that he'd always set up a way out, that he wasn't a man who broke fluently, yet there was commodity in Victor's presence tonight, commodity in the sharp radiance of his eyes and the slightly distinguishable twitch of his cutlet near the office hole, that suggested this was different, that this time the stakes were unimaginably advanced. He glanced at Phyllis, noting the subtle earthquake in her hands, the sweat that had formed along her hairline, the way her eyes danced around the room as if searching for an insolvable escape route, and for the first time, Kane understood just how deeply Victor could wound, how precisely he could orchestrate not just a battle but the obliteration of anyone who dared to challenge him. Phyllis's aspect caught a glint of commodity metallic on Victor's office, and in that moment the room converted in her mind from a familiar, opulent setting to a stage set for prosecution. Every shadow a implicit trouble, every reflection in the polished shells a memorial that there was no way out, that Victor's influence was universal and human. The air itself sounded heavier, thick with the scent of precious cologne and subtle fear, and as Kane's eyes scrutinized the room, noting every piece of cabinetwork, every oil, every detail, he realized that Victor hadn't only prognosticated their conduct but anticipated their every study, as though he'd lived inside their minds and counterplotted their moral sins, their vulnerabilities, their deepest fears. And Phyllis, however frequently brash, frequently fiery, frequently putatively impregnable, felt herself reduced to a child in a captain's den, every instinct screaming that survival needed commodity further than cunning, further than strength, further than the clever maneuvering that had always defined her, because Victor wasn't simply a man. He was a force of nature, grim and unyielding, able of reducing indeed the strongest choices to pulsing compliance with a bare regard. Subtle gesture, a faint flicker of movement. Kane shifted slightly, feeling the pressure in his shoulders, apprehensive of the globules of sweat forming there as he considered the myriad ways this could unfold. Every script darker than the last, from a drawn-out cerebral torment that could destroy them mentally and emotionally to commodity unrecoverable, endless, disastrous. He wondered how it had come to this, the choices and backstabbings that had piled upon one another like the layers of dust on a forgotten shelf, unnoticed until now, until the moment that Victor's presence made the entire history of their opinions visible and glaringly consequential. Phyllis, seeing Kane's apprehension, tried to undergird herself, knowing that fear would only make them easier prey, that fear was exactly what Victor wanted, yet despite the internal trouble, despite the conscious breathing, the shivering in her branches betrayed her, and Kane felt a stitch of helplessness for her, indeed as he fought his own surging fear. There was no unforeseen noise, no dramatic heralding of Victor's appearance, yet the room sounded charged, electric, every patch wobbling with pressure, with anticipation, with the ineluctability of battle. Kane considered speaking, but words felt shy, empty, unable of cutting through the suffocating presence of Victor's authority. The study crossed his mind that maybe no words could save them now, that survival would not come through concession but through understanding the implied game, the implacable, unnoticeable chess match that Victor always played, moving pieces without the others ever realizing until the wind-up was formally upon them. And also, as if seeing their scrutiny, Victor shifted slightly, and Cain caught the glint of his hand moving, the subtle but unmistakable readiness that spoke of the peril every mortal instinct screamed about. Phyllis stifled a rustle, and Cain placed a hand on her arm, not to restrain but to anchor her, to remind her that they were still a platoon, still two minds against one insuperable will. Yet indeed this act of consolation carried a fragility, an acknowledgement that in the face of Victor Newman, alliances were both lifeline and liability. Time sounded to decelerate, the seconds stretching endlessly, each crack of an unseen timepiece amplifying the suspension, the dread, the knowledge that any misstep, any flicker of mistrustfulness, any vacillation could cock the balance irrevocably. And Cain, though bent, though trained to manage extremity, felt the creeping shadow of vulnerability, the consummation that tonight wasn't simply a test of courage but a test of substance, a battle where once sins, present miscalculations, and implicit unborn consequences collided in a storm whose outgrowth sounded preordained by Victor's unyielding hand. Phyllis, too, felt the crushing weight of ineluctability, the mindfulness that Victor didn't simply discipline. He cancelled, leaving cerebral wreckage in the place of any perceived defiance. And as they stood, trapped, cornered, their eyes no way leaving Victor's, the study that this moment could define not just the night but their entire lives, their patrimonies, their individualities, settled over them with rough ineluctability. As in Victor's world, mercy was voluntary, and justice was frequently a armament applied with perfection and atrocity, and in this suspended silence, Cain and Phyllis realized that survival needed not just courage but a nuanced understanding of Victor Newman's mind, the capability to anticipate, to reply, to calculate the inappreciable signs, the subtle cues, the micro-expressions that might spell the difference between life and catastrophe. And yet, indeed as they braced for the unbelievable, indeed as their jitters screamed for action, for resistance, for escape, they knew in their deepest cores that the man before them was a storm of power and control, that Victor's detector cutlet could end everything, that one misstep could transfigure every dream, every plan, every stopgap into ruin, and in the suffocating intensity of that room, girdled by substance and trouble, Cain and Phyllis brazened the intimidating reality that in Victor's world, nothing was sacred, nothing was safe, and everything hung by the fragile, murderous thread of his will. The room sounded to palpitate with a life of its own, as though the walls themselves were cognizant, apprehensive of the stakes and complicit in the silent intimidation, reflecting the implied history that had accumulated in the Newman estate over decades, the rumored alliances, the covert backstabbings, the calculated palms that had cemented Victor's dominance and that now pressed like an unnoticeable weight on Cain and Phyllis, reminding them that this wasn't an arbitrary battle, but a strictly drafted trap, an apex of pressure designed not simply to discipline but to prize, to test, to leave unforgettable marks on the psyche of those who dared to challenge him. Cain's mind contended, calculating implicit moves, recalling every hassle with Victor that had ever left him unnerved, and noting that each former challenge had been a bare shadow compared to the intensity of this moment. Phyllis, meanwhile, felt her casket strain with every shallow breath, her mind swirling with recollections of once manipulations, her own intentions and mistakes intertwining with Victor's intentions to produce a shade of implicit ruin, each thread delicate, fraying, hanging to unravel under the scrutiny of Victor's aspect. Cain considered the room itself, noting the strategic placement of cabinetwork that could serve as obstacles or securities, the angles that might conceal movement, the way light and shadow played across the walls as if sharing in the suspension, amplifying the pressure, and yet every computation sounded inadequate, shy against a man whose mastery over cerebral warfare was unmatched, whose capability to anticipate, to dominate, to orchestrate events with perfection and slyness left indeed the most seasoned opponents vulnerable to fear and error. The memory of once Newman competitions visited him, Victor's pokes, his slice words, the icy certainty in his eyes that communicated a power that was absolute, a force that could strike reports, connections, and indeed livelihoods in a single deliberate moment, and Cain felt the creeping consummation that those former moments had been training for this ultimate showdown, and that every taradiddle, every retired verity, every secret that had ever passed between them was about to be weaponized in ways he'd slightly begun to comprehend. Phyllis's hand brushed against Cain's, a transitory attempt at comfort, but it was also an acknowledgement of participated vulnerability, a silent admission that neither of them could face Victor alone, and yet indeed in that combined moment, fear hovered to stamp strategy, instinct hanging to overpower intellect, as they both honored that survival needed not just concinnity but a precise understanding of Victor's mood, his intent, the inappreciable flickers of expression that could indicate mercy or its absence. The silence stretched, rough, pointed only by the faint creak of the floorboards as the house sounded to breathe, or maybe as if Victor himself allowed the very structure to support the graveness of the battle, reminding Cain and Phyllis that they weren't simply trespassers in a room, but actors in a cerebral arena where every sense was weaponized, every perception scanned, and every vacillation magnified into implicit catastrophe. Cain's studies shifted to once Palms, moments when he'd navigated Victor's cunning with skill and adaptability, yet none of those jests sounded acceptable, because tonight's stakes were unknown, and Victor's address conveyed a readiness that transcended typical wrathfulness or ambition, a dangerous calm that suggested premeditation, the kind of tolerance that only a man habituated to applying power mercilessly could maintain. Phyllis, ever perceptive, noticed the subtle tightening of Victor's jaw, the faint narrowing of his eyes, and honored that beneath the veneer of civility lay a bloodsucker completely apprehensive of its prey, a man able of moving decisively and without vacillation, whose detector cutlet, tropical or non-fictional, represented a trouble that could review their lives in a moment. Cain counted possibilities. Fleeing sounded insolvable, defying was dangerous, concession sounded futile, and yet the mortal instinct to survive surged, demanding action indeed as reason rumored caution, creating a conflict within that image the external pressure, the silent war being waged between Victor's almighty presence and their hopeless need for an escape. Memories of their once opinions, alliances formed and broken, secrets participated and withheld, judgments made in haste or under constraint, protruded through Cain's mind, each one now loaded with consequence, each one an implicit tool in Victor's magazine of cerebral influence, and he felt a cold consummation that this was further than discipline, this was an assignment, a test, a reckoning for choices that had sounded inconsequential until now. Each decision magnified in Victor's advised judgment. Phyllis's palpitation contended as she scrutinized the room, her aspect, catching subtle hints of vulnerability in the else perfect arrangement of the space, transitory signs that maybe indeed Victor's control had limits, though the stopgap they inspired was tenuous, fragile, nearly extinguished by the ever-present knowledge of the man's capacity for ruthlessness. Cain's studies returned to Victor's children, the Newmans, the conglomerate erected upon ambition and fear, and he realized that this battle was representational of Victor's entire approach to life, power maintained not through brute force alone, but through an intricate cotillion of dominance, manipulation and calculated threat, where those who opposed him were inescapably measured against an unyielding standard of submission or obliteration. And as the seconds dragged, each one an eternity, Cain felt the subtle shift in Victor's posture, the nearly inappreciable flex of his hand near the office hole, the readiness that spoke of a threshold being crossed, a decision ready to be made, and Cain knew that at any moment, the delicate balance between survival and catastrophe could cock irreversibly, leaving them exposed to consequences that would echo far beyond the immediate room, shaping lives, connections, and reports in ways neither could yet prognosticate. Phyllis's stomach twisted with the graveness of it all, the mindfulness that in Victor's world, morality was flexible, fidelity was transactional, and mercy was a currency allocated according to vagrancy or strategy, not principle. Cain's mind contended to implicit contingencies, imagining every possible outgrowth, yet each script sounded darker than the last, filled with layers of emotional, social and cerebral damage, and he realized that the very act of surviving this battle needed a mastery of calm, a perfection of study, and a concinnity of purpose that was delicate to sustain under similar inviting pressure. The murk in the room dragged as if time itself were conspiring against them, and the radiance of the chandeliers above came nearly narcotic, reflecting off polished shells in a show of pressure and dread, each scrap of light a memorial of the fragility of their position. Cain considered the history of Victor's dealings, the ruthless elimination of pitfalls, the cerebral games played over decades, and understood that tonight's battle wasn't simply a particular vendetta, but a demonstration of power, a assignment in dominance, a evidence that Victor's control over Genoa City and everyone within his route was absolute, and that resistance, indeed justified, carried a cost that could be irrecoverable. Phyllis's mind contended through a litany of once opinions, crimes and misapprehensions, each now glowing with acute applicability, each able of being twisted into influence by Victor's calculating mind, and she felt a eating fear that their only stopgap lay not in battle but in suspicion, In reading the subtle cues of a man whose motives were as inscrutable as they were absolute, whose capacity for foresight sounded measureless, and whose capacity for discipline was matched only by his capability to anticipate. Kane's own fear mingled with a strapped focus as if the pressure, rather than paralyzing him, honed his mindfulness, allowing him to catch micro-expressions, shifts in weight, the faintest changes in breathing that might indicate Victor's coming move, and yet the mindfulness of their participated vulnerability remained, a constant hum of anxiety threading through the room. Phyllis, apprehensive of Kane's pressure and her own, felt a contemporaneous swell of adrenaline and dread, understanding that their fates were entwined in this moment, that any error could affect in consequences far beyond their immediate perception, shaping reports, connections, and the veritably fabric of their lives, and that in Victor's realm, the conception of safety was a transitory vision, maintained only by adherence to his rules and recognition of his omnipotence. And as the seconds stretched, each crack of an imagined timepiece resonating in their minds, Kane and Phyllis brazened the intimidating clarity of the situation that Victor's detector cutlet, poised in tropical readiness, represented the absolute power he applied, the eventuality for desolation essential in his authority, and the fragility of their survival in the face of similar advised omnipotence, and that any misstep, any vacillation, any failure to anticipate his coming move, could affect in a slinging chain of consequences that would leave them not only exposed but ever altered. The murk of this battle moping like specters over every aspect of their lives, as Victor, case and unyielding, set to define the outgrowth with the perfection only he could command. Time sounded to stretch and underpinning in the Newman estate, each twinkle of Kane and Phyllis echoing in the room as though amplified by some unseen force, a cruel metronome marking the inexorable approach of peril that could be overrun, reasoned around, or bargained with. Kane's mind cycled fleetly through strategies, each further hopeless than the last, assaying the angles of the cabinetwork, the possible exits, the glint of Victor's watch catching the chandelier light and reflecting it like a silent, constant memorial of perfection, wealth and trouble combined into one murderous presence. Phyllis's breaths came briskly now, shallow but deliberate, as she tried to anchor herself with studies of what could be rescued, of the possibility that slyness, wit, or indeed sheer luck might grant them reprieve. However, deep down she understood that Victor's games were infrequently left to chance and that their survival would demand the kind of sapience and suspicion that framed on prescience. Kane noted the way Victor's shoulders slightly shifted as he leaned slightly forward, the deliberate cock of his head, the faint twitch of his fritters, all bitty signals loaded with meaning, warnings wrapped in countenance, and the knowledge of how important weight indeed a second could carry in a battle with a man like Victor made his casket strain with both fear and reticent admiration. Memories of once backstabbings, hidden motives and miscommunication swamped Kane's mind, a web of complications that now sounded more unfaithful than ever, the long-standing Newman heritage of power, vengeance and manipulation casting a shadow over every decision, every regard, every implied study in the room, a memorial that they were playing a high-stakes game where the board had formerly been listed before the pieces were indeed placed. Phyllis, noticing the subtle pressure in Kane's jaw and the miserliness of his hands, felt an odd admixture of consolation and terror. Consolation that they were facing the trouble together, terror because togetherness could only go so far against the implacable, nearly human force that Victor represented. The air itself sounded charged, electrically thick, the faint hum of the heating and cooling system mixing with the inappreciable creaks and groans of the manse as though the structure itself were apprehensive of the weight of the battle, holding its breath along with them, accentuating the rough sense that the moment was a pivot point in not just their lives, but in the fabric of control, power, and influence that Victor had painstakingly woven throughout Genoa City. Kane's studies, though clouded by adrenaline, kept returning to the notion that the fight, if it came, would not be fought simply with physical action but with strategy, suspicion, and the capability to read and manipulate an adversary whose experience and ruthlessness suppressed their own. Phyllis, her mind oscillating between fear and clarity, tried to flash back every detail that could be abused, every subtle weakness in Victor's regular address that might allow them indeed a splinter of maneuvering room, yet the more she concentrated, the further the weight of ineluctability pressed against her, a memorial that Victor was no way hasty, no way careless, no way without foresight, and that this battle had been designed with the scrupulous intent to bring Kane and Phyllis to a breaking point emotionally, mentally, and strategically. Kane shifted slightly, seeing the room's pressure as a living reality, nearly sentient, responding to the silent dialogue of ganders and posture, and the consummation that Victor had arranged not just the battle but the veritably energy of the room to manipulate their cerebral state transferred a shiver through him, cold and electric, as if fear itself had taken a physical form that pressed against his chine. Phyllis's aspect dallied on the faint radiance of the office's corner, imagining the emblematic weight of every object in the room, the power, the authority, the capacity to end plans, lives, and alliances with a single decisive stir. And she understood that survival would bear not just courage but a mastery of slyness, timing, and sapience, to read not only the visible cues but the unnoticeable currents of intent and expectation flowing from Victor, whose calm, controlled immanence was suffocating. In its certainty, the murk strengthened around the edges of the room, twisting the substance into a theater of dread, the foamy demitasse reflecting fractured casts of the tense tableau, each splinter of reflected light an echo of implicit consequences, and in that fractured, spangling terrain, Cain and Phyllis faced the most primitive mortal verity that in the presence of absolute power, control, and resolve, all differently was conditional, all additional precarious, and indeed the fewest misstep could unleash unrecoverable catastrophe. And as Victor's aspect swept over them, deliberate, measured, unyielding, they felt the full weight of the reality that had brought them then, the intricate snares of one's choices, the fragility of alliances, the merciless math of power, and understood, with a clarity born of fear and focus, that the detector cutlet they imagined, poised in tropical and maybe non-fictional readiness, could indeed end everything, leaving them exposed to consequences that would echo far beyond this single room, shaping the narrative of their lives, reports, and futures in ways they might no way completely comprehend or recover from, all in the hands of a man who had made controlling the fates of others an art form, and who now stood at the apex of judgment, case, precise, and hugely unappeasable.